No mai, haere mai, ki te kaupapa nei, everybody. Welcome to this session. To kick things off, this is a bit of a kaupapa Pākehā, so I will open things up with a blessing in a Pākehā language, Scottish Gaelic. Aon and behas bas, and I'm a yellow of a new, if chi, the sake mood, the line cune, or line gadava, hashinya aon. Kunyich mimage ko hanin. Kunyich mimage medunya von tanig shin. This horomage lenia dono parakia new, big a shin shiran motjalasin. Sanjanka dunyas on cheers shovohus, in the tongue of this land knows best, tihe mauri order. Tēnā koutou. If you are listening and or watching, you have arrived at the session for perspectives on the origins of the Pākehā wing of the Tiriti workers movement. My name is Dani Pickering. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am Pākehā myself, and I will be your chair for this session. Just a bit of housekeeping. As a reminder, Tiriti-based future sessions have a community code of conduct that we ask you to abide by to ensure a fulfilling experience is had by all. We all welcome you to interact with other attendees during the session using the chat feature, but we ask that any questions asked during the session make use of the Q&A feature. And today, depending on how things go, we may or may not have time for a Q&A. We'll see. We have a specific set of objectives with this session, so we'll get to that in a moment. I also want to flag, for the sake of the chat and the Q&A, we also have a moderator working behind the scenes to make sure that the social side of things continues to run smoothly today. So ngā mihi nui kia koe to our moderator. And yeah, so we've got two incredible speakers today with one hell of a background, or two hells of a background, in this movement space. Karena and Katherine Peet are joining us today to share some of their hard-won wisdom about what it means to do Tiriti work from a Pākehā positionality and across generations. So Karena is a Pākehā anti-racist activist and Tiriti worker based in Pākehā, Auckland, here in Aotearoa. She's been involved in the Māori land and language struggles and anti-racism action since the 1970s, and the Treaty workers movement since the 1980s, with a history of involvement in the Waitangi Action Coalition, co-founding the Pākehā Anti-Racism Coalition, and later Project Waitangi Pākehā. After that, she spent about 9 years working in the Auckland Area Health Board as a racism intervention educator, and has more recently been working with a variety of childcare, health, local body, and community organizations to realize their own Tiriti goals. This is consistently on the ground experience, means that Karena has not only witnessed but participated firsthand in the development of strategies that treaty educators and anti-racist activists have deployed in their efforts to honor Te Treaty of Waitangi. All reasons that I am so incredibly excited to get a chance to really get stuck in and chat with Karena about how that has all played out and what that's been like and what we can learn from it for posterity's sake. Katherine, meanwhile, identified as Tangata Tiriti, has British ancestors from Scotland, England, and Ireland, has done some work in forensic science and then secondary teaching, moved into the field of adult education in the 1970s, and has been very focused on Network Waitangi Ōtautahi since about 1984. After teaching in secondary schools, both here in Aotearoa and abroad, Katherine has worked in the NGO, third sector, sort of voluntary sector, and sees it as an important side of creativity and responses to injustice. She's been married for 51 years to John, all blessings and wishes for his speedy recovery at the moment, and is involved caring for 3 children and 26 years of living alongside them. So Katherine has been part of the Workers' Education Associations and its National Federation here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the International Federation as well, and represented that at the UNESCO Adult Education Conferences, and been very, very focused on a range of adult education kaupapa over the last 30 years or so. So yeah, I think that between the two of you, there's so much, and such a diverse history of backgrounds and movements that you've tapped into and been maybe shoulder tapped for, that I really cannot wait to really get to hear more about from both of you. Additionally, I need to acknowledge that we were intending to have a third panelist today, Ray Nairn, who unfortunately for health reasons is unable to join us. But we want to acknowledge collectively that Ray and the late Mitzi Nairn have all played unspeakably huge roles in the development of Pākehā specific Tiriti work since its inception. So we are also hoping for his swift and full recovery. Lastly, before I start turning it over to you two, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the Pacific peoples whose relationships with tangata whenua and predate and intertwine with Te Tiriti in their own ways, as well as tauiri from the global majority whose histories with Māori are also long-standing and essential to the development of what it means to be tangata Tiriti today. The discussion that follows is scoped specifically in wake of all this, in the context of all of this, to the Pākehā contributions and struggles within this wider movement. And even then, we are not spokespeople for the Pākehā wing even. We are standing on the shoulders of many, many, many giants, and we're gonna start cracking into that in a moment now. Yeah, so that's a lot of talking from me. Let's get moving. So yeah, Karena, Katherine, we're here basically to pin down the origins of the Pākehā wing of the treaty workers movement. So obviously there's so many individuals, organizations, and even other movements that we could name until we've identified everyone involved in every struggle in Aotearoa. So let's try to narrow this down just a little bit more, shall we? And I'll do my bit to keep you on topic, but maybe starting with Karena and then Katherine, could you each name some of the biggest influences you've seen on the Pākehā treaty workers movement that helped kind of help bring it into existence? Like, what were the key influences that made it happen to begin with? Starting with you, Karena.
Oh, kia ora, Dani. First of all, I want to say kia ora koutou to everyone. It's a great honour to be here speaking on behalf of many, many, many colleagues, both Māori, Pākehā and Pacifica, who have been involved in all of these massive issues over the years, and that I'm just a very small part of a very active and committed group. And in particular, I'd like to honour the two people who have been with me throughout the time that you just talked about, Dani, my two daughters, Cara and Rachel, and and who have come to meetings and been to protests and have also missed out on time with me at times that they probably needed me a lot, especially during their teenage years. So I just want to say, ngā mihi aroha, kia kōrua. And to my whānau now, my beautiful moko and moko, what a joy it is for you to be living with some of the changes that many of us were involved in. So if I'm going to talk about, you know, what the influences were, I had a very strong commitment to social justice from a very young age. And when I had my two daughters, I was determined that they were able to live in a world that were addressing some of these issues that in my upbringing seemed to have been ignored and were not actually spoken about. So that at the beginning of the late 1960s and early 70s, there seemed to be very little for us Pākehā to find a way into looking at our own history and through our own cultural biases. And we couldn't help but notice, of course, that the things that were going on in the world that Mitzi has very kindly written and listed for us in this little booklet, which covers a lot of work from a lot of people and a lot of organisations. But the things that I and some of my colleagues were involved in were the reclaiming of Bastion Point, of course, Ngāti Whātua and the Hawk whānau, Keskedi Aroha, which travelled throughout the country, anti-nuclear, anti-war, pro-Greenpeace, that 81 tour, the 75 March Hikoi, with the stance of not 1 acre more, that we did see through our media. Donna Awatiri, you know, she wrote this and broadsheet published these amazing essays which really challenged us on who we were. And then in the beginning of the 1980s, I started working with Bob Scott and Mitzi Nien at the National Council of Churches. I met them because I wanted to start a pilot anti-racism program within schools, because we kept hearing that if we educated young people, then the world would change. And I was doing that through the applied diploma of social work. And they sent me off to the National Council of Churches and said, go and talk to these people, which I did. And they were very open and very supportive. And I began working in their office and ran those programs with 2 schools. And then I started running workshops with Bob and Mitzi with different organisations. And then Bob and I ran a workshop for anyone who wanted to attend, a public anti-racism workshop, with Te Whai Harawira as our monitor. And out of that workshop, a group developed called Pākehā Anti-Racism Coalition, who are made up of about 15 to 20 people. And we formed a strong relationship with Waitangi Action Coalition as our, nowadays we would call them our treaty partners, but then we talked about being accountable. So we had an accountability to WAC. And the first thing we did was offer our services to go out and fix up their offices in Otara, which we did. We met weekly, and one of the other actions that came through to us was if we could fundraise to so that one of the members of Waitangi Action Coalition could go to the Indian Treaty Committee meetings in America. And I think that we committed to raising $3,000 a year, which back then, and most of us were unemployed, we did through very active fundraising, which also involved a lot of groups who were outside of our group who committed a certain amount of money weekly towards that. And we were able to ensure that the member from Waitangi Action Committee always got to those meetings for some years. The other things that we were involved in was fundraising for a local kohanga to be built at the primary school, which was close to us in Grey Lynn, Ritimana. And we were involved in fundraising and actively building that kohanga, which opened in 1985, and which now my moko and moko have all been attending there as well. Just a little personal blessing for our whānau. We connected with Ngāneko Minhanek and the issues of the iron sands at Maioro with Ngāti Tiata. And we got involved in doing a lot of education work. But the education was always aimed towards some kind of action that would, our questions were always things like, you know, how is this going to benefit Māori? So the groups that we worked with, we always had an action component at the end of our education programs, so that they had an opportunity to decide what their organisations or groups or community or neighbourhood would want to be involved in. There were a lot of issues and challenges for us that came towards us in relation to how difficult, or how, I have to say, badly treated the Māori who are bringing up these issues were, and how misrepresented they were through the media, and then the what we would call hate mail and actions from also the police, which was devastating for them. So one of the things that happened during the 1980s was, I'm just going to reach over and pull out, was that Atirita Pōlangan, an amazing activist. She was with Te Ahi Kā. She talked about, and I'm not going to quote it because I can't remember exactly, but it was kind of like saying, this is our place, and this is our land, and this is what's happened with us, and this is the history that's happened, and this is what tino rangatiratanga is about. And I think her question was like, if you, meaning non-Māori Pākehā really, if you can't find a way to support us, and if you are unhappy with acknowledging this, then maybe you might want to think about going back to where you came from. And that created, of course, a lot of the way that the media took a very small part of what she said and reported on that. There was huge backlash against her personally. And so we, Pākehā Anti-Racism Coalition, thought about what would we do about that. And what we did was we created...
cut you off there, Karena. We're going to come back to that though, so hold the thought. That's okay. For sake of time, not for sake of time, like I said, we're going to circle back to that. But I want to get a bit of a view from Katherine as well. So, because Karena, the other thing I forgot to introduce about our two speakers today is that they both come from a different motu. So Karena is coming from the Tamaki Makaurau context, and Katherine is down in Te Waipounamu at the moment. So we're getting a wide spectrum of experiences and people across the country here. And so in terms of, again, the biggest influence you saw on the Pākehā Treaty movement kind of coming to be, Katherine, what did that look like from your side of things too?
Well, you asked me to start with the influence of the WEA, Dani, so I will. And it is best understood backwards, because a lot of people don't know that the acronym is for Workers' Educational Associations. So associations, really, there are 6 in this country, 5 of whom still meet as a federation, and it belongs to an international federation. So that was the, and education is the next letter if you're going backwards from associations, and that's always been in the current social context, and I think that becomes rather important. The workers word is really because it's not employer-driven education. And the academic support for the WA has been very good, all the time, but it's on a par with, to quote, the smitings of potters and weavers, and much that can be not learned from books. So the WA started here in 1915 with a different flavour, and other organisations then formed, and then there was a membership body called ACE, Aotearoa, Adult and Community Education, Aotearoa. The earlier form of that was called NACED, using the acronym NZACCE, the New Zealand Association for Community and Continuing Education. And NACED was the first organisation I came across who caucused into tangata whenua and tangata tiriti to make decisions. And so that was Ngāre Tahira's time, which many of you might know. Te Atarangi has been a long-standing member of ACE. it has also been closely associated with UNESCO, which you mentioned, and I think the 12-yearly conference there has led to a lot of resources on community research, which has had a big influence, I think, on bringing the Pākehā treaty workers movement into existence. People picked up the community development approach, as it was often called. And so returning to examples from the part of the WA that always has supported movements for justice. I mean, the Canterbury WA supported Lincoln Efford's right to be a pacifist in the middle of the Second World War, and had the first meeting on nuclear-free weapons in there. Revolting people were pivotal to the WA, and I think that's been an influence in the Pākehā treaty movement too. People have come together from all sorts of corners to take on this particular educational approach. And so while there have been some difficulties along the journey, I do think this has brought people into framing ways to build understanding. And we've paid tribute to a lot of people so far, but there is just one person I think that I would like to bring into the room, and that's Mona Jackson.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Tītiwhai. I also happen to just have picked up her book recently. So, I mean, these are all, you know, we could go on forever. I think too, another big early influence that was the proportion of Kiwis who travel outside the country. Their discovery that home was not primarily the various parts of Britain or other places from which their ancestors travelled. And new immigrants kept commenting on free airport trolleys, people smiling at strangers, getting out of bed on Saturday morning to go to sport. And the experience of this country as distinct, I think, has contributed to this feeling of knowing what it means to be Pākehā Tauiwi. Of course, some of these people outrightly oppose and don't recognise colonisation or indigeneity, but it's still been a starting point in my experience. The feminist movement, I think, of the 70s was really important in identifying the need for dominant groups to give up power. And a particular example of that was when a woman, naming herself as a black woman, challenged a reporter's reference to her being from the developing world, quote unquote, and stated that she regarded white feminism to be lacking. How to address the dominant power, the power of dominant groups rather, where community development practice has influenced, has, I think, been one of the trailblazing aspects of the work here in this country. The responses were not imported from America or Australia. They were thought about here and were trailblazing. The church was very much in the mix at this time, and in the 1980s, the ecumenical collaboration in Christchurch was astounding, way beyond institutional boundaries. And the Corso was getting cracking, the Citizens Association for Racial Relief Services Overseas, that's what it was underway, asserting that racism in this country was alive and well. There was a magazine, Race, Gender, Class, that included snippets from other places, which is how we got to know about the things that were happening that Karena has been mentioning. The program on racism from the Conference of Churches was something we all used, and well, certainly those of us in the treaty movement. And in Christchurch, the collaboration between CCA and Z, which was the Protestant lot, got together with the Catholic lot under the Commission for Justice and Development of the Catholic Church. And these resources were what further strengthened the capacity to engage with community development work approaches around the country. And we got to learn to work from the experience of people who had the problem, having something to say about the problem, which was kind of, you know, Paulo Freire and all that. We'll come to that later. I guess I want to just add that that people who stood up for what was the right thing to do developed a deeper understanding of institutional violence and depth of colonisation, because for privileged people like myself, my dad's reminder, often given to me, puts it quite well. You can't do nothing. If you do nothing, something is actually happening around you. And addressing injustice was actually not really taught, but it was more caught for those of us who were involved in the WEA. And the pointy end of this took me out of institutional education and really first into adult and community education generally through the WEA experience, and then focus on more on treaty education. So when teaching in Wales, I really got exposed to the violence of the education system, delivering in a language that wasn't the first language of the students. And this is what meshed me into the work of Turunaka ki o Tatahi o Kaitahu. So that's where I really would like to expand a little bit, if there's a bit of time, either now
I'll give you
or
a minute.
Pardon?
I could give you maybe a little
Well,
one
it's
more
just
minute.
that I think Turunaka was really important because of the fact that it was led by Maurice Gray, who was so involved with the institutional church as well, and deeply connected with Christchurch as well as overseas, because his international experience through his appointment at the Resource Management Centre at Lincoln and Canterbury Universities took us all into resources on ecological economics and all that kind of thing, which has been a great addition to the way we work. And I think by challenging us not to accept substitutes of the treaty, we have become sharper. Even when the Waitangi Tribunal has been set up, we've supported it because while it may be not perfect, it sure is better than nothing. So I think we have to carry on.
Kia ora, Katherine. Yeah, so thank you for both so much for that. Like that sense of just all of these different movement influences that have shaped what treaty work has become, from all of the anti-racist work that was being done in Pākehā communities even before we started talking about Te Tiriti. Karena, I'm really grateful to get a bit more of an insight into that, and just all those other movement influences and educational influences from you, Katherine. Really, really grateful. Something that I'd love to hear more from both of you about, especially in the context of, I guess, being a younger person who wasn't alive during the time where this pivot happened. I really want to hear more from both of you about that pivot point where there was a period of history where the rhetoric was sort of the treaty as a fraud, and it wasn't the focus of anti-racism for sake of Māori, either on behalf of or by. There was that pivot point, right, between going from the treaty as a fraud to now we talk about honouring the treaty, honouring Te Tiriti. I've got a t-shirt that says that now. Like, that is so the norm, and it didn't used to be, and that was a real surprise to me. And I want to hear more from both of you about how that change took place. When did that pivot happen? What did it look like from where each of you were standing in your context within the movement? Starting with you, Karena.
Well, the treaty as a fraud, of course, came about because the treaty was never honoured. The voices of tangata whenua, the iwi and hapu who were involved in negotiating both the Declaration of Independence, which came before the treaty, and the treaty were completely disregarded. Their rights were trampled on. Their land was stolen. Their people were murdered and killed, and they became disenfranchised within their own land. So the treaty as a fraud really comes about from an understanding that it was a tool they used, and which is a line of a song that we wrote about, Hobson using the treaty as a tool to have Pākehā domination here in this country, and for the land company to be able to just make a profit out of stealing land, I suppose, and selling it often to new settlers who didn't know that the land had been stolen. And then during the 1980s, of course, we were coming up to 1990. And 1990 was the sesquicentennial of the celebrations of the signing of the treaty. So that was one of the things that we needed to start thinking about. But even the language, though, of Te Tiriti, we have been using in our anti-racism understanding. So we always talked about being committed to our country, where tino rangatiratanga was a reality, and that Māori had mana motahaki over the whole of the country. And so it wasn't a new thing for us to turn to the treaty, but we did learn a lot more. There was so much that we didn't know at the beginning of the 1980s that we learned from Māori, of course, and then also from a whole lot of research that was being done by many, many people throughout the motu, and that the importance of the Declaration of Independence and how that explains the difference clearly between kāwanatanga and tino rangatiratanga. And so we were able to then think about how kāwanatanga is a place for us to stand and to be and to say who we were. And the phrase tangata treaty started to become a way that we could identify ourselves more as well within the place that we stood. So the other thing that happened was this thing called the fiscal envelope, where the government decided that there was only going to be a certain amount of time and a certain amount of money for Māori to hurry up and get their claims into the Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal. So we formed a group called Auckland Anti-Racism Network, and another one called Auckland Treaty Action Committee, in partnership with He Taua, which was a group who challenged the engineering students some years before, when they were annually taking off the haka as part of the university celebrations. Anyway, so what we did was we commissioned Emari Karaka to create a painting about the fiscal envelope, which we made into large posters, and then we sold those posters to raise funds for Māori to be able to pay some of their legal fees, that they had to pay to present their cases to the tribunal. And we also started then to have to prepare for what was going to happen for 1990, and the initiative of a nationwide education process for Pākehā came about from discussions throughout the motu, and Project Waitangi was a project that began from those discussions to address the lack of knowledge about Te Tiriti, the understandings of Te Tiriti, and how, because it was now being written into the State-Owned Enterprises Act and all of the different acts, including health and museums, etc., we needed to have a greater understanding of that. So Project Waitangi Tamaki Makaurau, and we began that group up here as well, but we very much responded to the work that was done by the national organisation down in Wellington, the first Project Waitangi group, and the work that Mitzi Nian and Accord had put into creating the resources. For example, a question and answers resource that Mitzi began back in the 1980s as well. And then from that initiative, we began the whole a much greater education program for Pākehā.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Karena. That's such a, that fills in a lot of gaps for me even now, even though we've talked about this in preparation for today. Like, that framing makes a lot of sense to me now, puts a lot of pieces together. Can Katherine, what did that look like for you? Same question to you. Like, how did you witness the pivot from the treaty as a fraud to ona te tiriti from the context of Te Waiponamu?
I'm going to try to complement what Karena has.
It was a hard question to try to make you both.
Project Waitangi o Tautahi, I guess, has always worked through having a relationship with Tirinaka ki o Tautahi o Katahu in the first place, and then those relationships changed, and we had relationships with Mana Whenua from the get-go. And so that lens was there, and when, for example, the treaty was a fraud, I first of all, I just could agree, no problem, and understood the argument. And educationally, I guess we responded by, for example, highlighting the wedge of social change, which had come up as a tool. So, people who were out the front pushing the boundaries at the very front also needed to be supported by people at the back. And so this took the pressure off for some people who were finding it was all too much, and they could still do something, because I guess my goal has always been to follow my dad's instruction that you have to do something. You can't just sit there. And so that was part of it. I guess that historically it was important that we saw it as part of the momentum that had come in from all sorts of corners with the social justice. There had been an understanding of just the depth of what had gone on. But we always had this background behind us, which was that the treaty, is an invitation to be here if it's honoured. So the imperative was to always get on and try to do something about bringing about a treaty-based future. So the important part of that, I suppose, was the work with Hui Whakamana Tiriti, which was set up in Christchurch to do this work, to bring in all the stuff from the North Island and try and make it sort of relevant locally. So that was set up by Tirinaka ki o Tautahi o Katahu, and quite a lot of people met regularly. And Morris Gray was really important in those early days. So there was a lot of bringing in of academic-y stuff, which helped with this addressing of supporting the treaty was a fraud for the reasons outlined that had been given, but also to try to bring in alongside ways of working which encouraged people to get their shoulders down and keep going with what the Aucklanders seem to always refer to as anti-racism work, and we wanted to bring in gender and class and all the other social justice issues. But we tried to bring the lot. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you both. That was a question I've wanted to ask people about for a while now. It's just really nice to see that.
I've got another 2 pages here if you'd like.
Oh, I'm not sure we got time for that. I think we do have time I want to kind of get into, to me, I think one of the meatier questions, which is after this pivot towards Te Tiriti, you two have both spoken to it a little bit and how it's begun to really shape the way that, it's gone and fed back into a lot of these movements that have informed what became the treaty workers movement, right? So we've got, anti-racism fed into treaty work, like workers' movements, church influences, feminist influences, Māori influences, of course. And now we've also kind of seen, the treaty start to feed into these others as well. But I guess what I'm curious about now is how did your work change after that pivot to Te Tiriti? What are you doing now that is treaty focused in a way that maybe your involvement in those movements prior to this pivot point weren't really focusing on? Like, what changed for you once it became like about honoring the treaty? Does that question make sense?
Well, just talking about the word racism, actually, if we move away from talking about racism, which a lot of people find very confronting, and I mean, I certainly did too, because who wants to be a racist? Because we understood it, and initially we understand it in a personal way. It's like, oh, I'm a racist. but understanding racism in relation to a systemic process and a structural process was very important and still is. However, when we talk about the treaty, it's helpful for us to be able to understand the very unique and in a way, it was such a blessing to have a treaty in this nation, because it gives us a place to speak from and to understand where our place is, understanding that we're not Indigenous here and that we're not tangata whenua, and no matter how much we might learn about respecting tangata whenua and learn about tikanga and te reo and everything, we will never be tangata whenua ourselves. But we do have a prideful place in enacting being tangata tiriti. And now I've gone off your question, but so what the government did in the 80s, and is now actually we're noticing a lot of pullback from, is to write the treaty into policy. And so that gave us a place to be able to focus on how the policy would work locally or within an organisation. And that's where the Auckland Hospital Racism Intervention Program came from. And then to make best practice decisions. In other words, what is the practice of enacting this treaty within this organisation that means that changes are made to ensure that Māori have cultural safety and and be able to be decision makers within organisations, so that the organisations are there and benefit them in accordance to tino rangatiratanga and kāwanatanga. And so I do want to mention, like with this program here, was very much a program that came about because of people like Dr. Paparangi Reid and the work that she'd done on Māori health and within the School of Medicine, and the understanding from a management point of view and the Race Relations Office that only having Māori working within Pākehā organisations as advisors did not enact the kind of decision-making power that Māori should have rightfully, so that the decisions are made from the get-go that are going to be the best possible decisions to have the best possible outcomes for Māori within health, within education, within social justice, within the environment, within decisions about rivers, the whole lot. Brilliant. So for a period of time, that seemed to be working in a way that was much more treaty-based. And I have to say that in the last couple of years with this government, what we've seen is a pulling back and in a way a denigration of the work that has been achieved by the people that have really put their lives and their hapu and their iwi on the line here. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Karena. Katherine, over to you. If I might reiterate the question to jog your memory a bit. But yeah, how have you seen the treaty itself and the shift towards it being a large focus in our politics? How has that changed the way that you've done your mahi?
Well, I think it's always enabled us to sort of deal with the paralysis from analysis of understanding things better, and therefore given us a framework for the future. And I think that was helped for me in terms of sort of some in-depth stuff by the shift in adult and community education, to use that ACE term again, internationally, when there was Julius Nyerere in the 1970s that made a statement to the outside world that said that education was in a twofold perspective of personal and societal development, or something along those lines. So that shifting into the societal thinking was really where I think the work for me was focused. And it seemed a solid sort of way of setting up an implementation of the treaty thinking, which has really stayed with us, which is around the need to understand the history, but to all, she says, grabbing her arm as the blood flow, and seeing that the wrist as the pivot for all of that being the declaration, with the first sort of statement to the outside world that was acknowledged by at least by the commercial world in 1835, and then the treaty having the 5 aspects to it, which was often missed. The preamble was often missed out,
Yeah, sure.
and the first protocol was often missed out. And we often bring those two together because they're sort of saying we're going to do things peacefully and care for each other and make sure that unlike Australia, Indigenous people will at least have a say in being a quote unquote citizen. And then the 3 aspects of the treaty enabling that. So that's the angle that we've taken it, so that we talk about the need to build honourable kāwanatanga, because we ain't got it, to a need to restore tino rangatiratanga, which has always been there. Unfortunately, it's the longest finger, which is helpful. And the 3rd article, which says that, you know, Māori should be able to just lead the way. They're there, and that's the outcome. So it's that stepping back and learning all those things that has been really the driving force, and making visible in our communities the activity that people do that is not counted, like Marilyn Waring's Counting for Nothing. Those sorts of experiences help people bring themselves into the room as Pākehā with their values and their sense of place to form allyship with tangata whenua. And it's that allyship which I think has been really named and trailblazed by Asians for Tino Rangatiratanga. And I think there's so many people now working, you know, on great things that I want to say that everybody's work is important. It's just that I think it's really important not to substitute Te Tiriti or Waitangi with anything else. And I think sometimes that has happened with laws and things like that. I mean, probably better than nothing, but not as good as it could be. So we have to keep nagging.
Oh, kia ora, Catherine.
I think that's what we do, just keep nagging, you know.
Yeah, that's our job.
May I just come back in?
Yeah. One more thing. We've got some time.
Thank you, Catherine. It's lovely to hear that you talking about the Te Treaty in such detail. And one of the things that I love about the treaty is that at the end of the preamble, it says, and these are the laws agreed to, which is a statement that most of us didn't even know existed, and it's really helpful for seeing clearly the roles of tino rangatiratanga and the roles of kāwanatanga, and knowing that this was set up as our constitution. These are the laws that have been agreed to. Yeah.
And I think, Dani, we shouldn't go much further in this
No.
without talking about matiki mai and that from tangata whenua, and also to remind ourselves of the work that the Quakers and Peace Movement Aotearoa did only in 2021. It's not that long ago. Sorry, 2012. Sorry, whatever. 2012. You know, the years passed. But this constitutional transformation is really the important thing, and it has to be based on he whakaputanga, te tiriti, and human rights instruments, you know, and I think that those bring, I think there's just so much here, and yeah, I'm trying to stop.
Oh, all good. This is we've actually got a bit of time here, and
that's what I'm hoping, that we've got some time for questions. I'm trying to be good.
Yes, so it looks like we do have time for questions now. So far, we've got one in the Q&A rather than the chat input. If anyone else has questions, I'll read out the first one in a moment. But now would be a really good time if anyone's got some pātai to put to Karena or Katherine about their histories with this movement and what they've learned from it. Now's a great time. Or apparently we can ask Mitzi as well.
Indeed.
Yeah, so first of all, I've got a question asking to you both. Well, the first part of the question is only 3 words. Where to now? How do we help Pākehā to let go of power and encourage others to do the same? We're particularly interested here in the long-term vision. So maybe Matike Mai is actually a good jumping off point for that, potentially.
I'll just jump in there, because when you say to let go of power, I absolutely agree with you. If you mean the power to continue to reduce everything to one person, one vote and majorities and all that kind of thing. But learning to live in a way that actually hate the language of empowering, so I'm not going to use that, but learning to live in a way that is based on tino rangatiratanga, where the authority is bubbles up, is just a whole nother way of operating, and actually is really full of power. So I just want to distinguish between the form of power that is predicated on individual property rights, that sort of power. And of course, our voting system is predicated on individual property rights. So all of those things bring us into challenges, I think now, of needing to look at ecological economics and to really shift the dial on that front, especially in the current social context, she says, politically carefully.
Very nice. Anything to add there, Karena?
Well, we're it's also recognizing the international situation, which we acknowledging we all have heavy hearts with all that's going on at the moment, and how vulnerable we are, and how important it is to hold on to our original agreements with Indigenous peoples of this place, because I and many likewise believe that that living in accordance to tino rangatiratanga means that we take care of Papatuanuku, of Gaia, of Mother Earth, of the very land from where we've come and that maintains and sustains us, and in our present crisis that we've been part of, knowingly or unknowingly creating, learning, like being humble in our learning, and finding our way with reconnecting with ourselves as humans as being not superior to or dominant of, but just another animal, another part of the ecosystem, and honouring the way that tangata whenua understand that this land here is for us, and it's our role to be taking care of it. And what does that mean for us individually, community, nationwide?
Karena.
Yeah, I guess we just have come up with 3 new L's in there. Local, learning, and living for a treaty-based multicultural future. I mean, we're just sort of where the Indigenous status, all that other, but that local learning and living is kind of, I think, a way of being at the moment, which can sustain people to find their place, and as Karena talked about.
Yeah. We've got 2 more questions in here, and for sake of time, I'm going to make an attempt at blending them together a little bit, and maybe you can tackle an aspect of it that each makes sense to you. We've got a question here asking about whether you get involved with Māori communities in your mahi, because as I understand the history and the purpose of Pākehā Treaty work is to work amongst our own to get the roadblocks out of the way so that Māori can practice the tino rangatiratanga. So are there exceptions to that sort of rule, I guess, of we work with our own people so that Māori don't necessarily have to all the time? It would be the first question here. And the other question we have here is, how do you move your kōrero out of the safety of your allies? I am constantly challenged by my tauiwi friends and it's tiring. So how do we, how do I interpret that? So thinking less about like our safety and dignity, as important as those elements are, but you know, as allies to Māori struggle, they're secondary to our purpose to support Māori, right? And part of that is by not being challenges, but getting the roadblocks out of the way, right? So if we can maybe tackle one element of those questions, like when we work with Māori versus when we work with our own people, and when we're working with our own people, how do we make sure that we are becoming less tiring for Māori, I suppose?
Yeah. Well, from experience, if I go back to the building of Ritimana Kohanga Reo, my husband and I, Andrew, we joined the committee, which of course was Māori committee, and had regular meetings. And they were constantly asking us, what did we think? And we were constantly saying, it's not for us to say in this discussion. This discussion is, this process of decision making here is not for us to be involved in, because this is your kaupapa. What we're here for is to find out how much money we need, how much, what's the actual nuts and bolts of the work that needs to be done, and what's the roadblocks, you call them, what's getting in the way. And one of the things they asked us to do, which was quite challenging for us, was that when the kohanga was just about to be opened, they were making plans about, basic stuff like food. And the Māori committee came to us and they said, look, there's Pākehā parents who want to have their children come to learn te reo, which is, kapai. But now they're telling us what we should have on the menu for all of the children to eat. And we're wondering if you might go and have a talk to them, because we're finding it very difficult. And the people they were talking, some of the parents, they were our friends. I mean, we all lived in Grey Lynn. And we did go and we said, yes, okay, we'll do that. We went and talked with our friends and we talked about how it was a kaupapa Māori and it wasn't really our place to be making decisions, and that they would, and that, it was a privilege, an incredible privilege for Pākehā to be learning te reo in this kohanga, because there were so few kohanga and there were so few opportunities for Māori to learn their own language. So we did. Yes, and then we didn't have those friends anymore after that. So I hear what's being said. It's hard, it's difficult. We're all trying to be different than our ancestors. There aren't necessarily, guidelines for how to have a discussion like that. And answering the other question, like, do we work with Māori or?
Do you get involved within Māori communities in your mahi specifically? What's the question?
Yes, well, we always have. So we've always had a relationship with whoever has been the Māori who are working in that particular area that we've joined them to work with. At Auckland Hospital, I was working with Amohari Tangitu and with a Māori group committee who met to oversee the program. And so with any change process, so and I'm including Katherine in this as well, is that we have been very fortunate to participate in discussions and challenges and wayfinding with Moana Jackson and people like him.
I might actually cut you off there, Karena, just because we're starting to go over time, and I want to make sure Katherine gets a chance to speak to these
sure.
as well. But thank you so much.
Our work is really been focused on making resources available under the Creative Commons license wherever possible, sharing everything we can share, because this work is hard. And so we just try to make it as accessible to everybody else who's doing it as that we have, and sharing and getting feedback. And I just guess there is no safety, and sometimes it's very lonely, and you just have to get on with it.
Kia
ora.
Kia ora, Katherine.
Well, I guess you have a question specifically for Karena in the chat, which you don't have to answer, I think, given the context of it. But who's your favorite moko is the pata that's been posed.
I saw that and I cracked up. Thank you so much, Moko, for cracking me up during this presentation.
That's all good. That's all good. Oh, I'm so glad we actually had time to do some of these parts. I wasn't sure we'd be able to, given just the huge scope of what we've tried to cover with just within this hour. So yeah, thank you both so much for all of your decades of contributions to this movement. You know, it would be so easy for us to just look at the problems of the world today and assume that things are getting unilaterally worse. And I think that would actually just be this enormous disservice to some of the achievements that have been made across the board. So like the one that I'll speak, I think that this movement context speaks very specifically to is just the fact that non-Māori are now more ready than ever to take the plunge and embrace Tiriti-based futures, whatever they may look like. So you two have no doubt played important roles, and I suppose in the multi-generational wave of change. So ngā mihi nui, kei mila taing, 100,000 thanks. Thanks as well to all of the volunteers and partners who have helped bring Tiriti-based futures to life for, what is this, the third or maybe the fourth time? We've got about 65 organizations backing this year's event. And I want to thank all the background tech people as well for this session who've been keeping all of our tech running smoothly, our moderator as well on the social side of things. Really appreciate all of your mahi. There will be some associated events with a couple of the other partners who are doing things in relation to Tiriti-based futures, so keep an eye out for those. This session has been recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube and be on the Tiriti-based futures website for posterity's sake. We kind of envisioned this from the beginning as a bit of an oral history to capture some of the stories that haven't been a big part of the movement's recorded history before now. So yeah, it's been a real joy to work with all of you to bring this into reality. Kia ora, and yeah, ngā mihi nui. To close us out, I would like to wrap up with another blessing in Scottish Gaelic. Nach Jún sich sin lesson in the Chida, Colorish and Nawi Navan and Roya. Nach Jean Shin Eid, nach Jean Shin Richela, Spahahane Fjörg and Till. Let us learn the lessons of the land together with those who came before. Let us protect them, let us protect each other, and life itself the world over. Sanjankavunius don Chief Strovohus, in the tongue that this land knows best. Homye, huye, dai ye. Thank you for coming, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Ka kite.